Absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody, for those comments. I seen a few head nods, as well as, not in that you're falling asleep, but that you're agreeing with what the panelists are saying, or something that they're saying is resonating with you. So we have received a few questions from our colleagues here in the room. And so one of these questions is really thinking about the focus on and the investment in built environment. An observation from this person is that so much of that investment tends to happen in the most wealthiest, as well as the coastal cities and communities of our country. So the question is really thinking about the paradox between where obesity rates are actually the highest is not necessarily on the coast and in the large urban centers. So thinking about what can we do to really try to help prioritize built environment investments and prioritization, if you will, in rural and poorer areas of this country. So if anyone would like to chime in, we don't have to go in order, but we can.
Okay.
Okay.
I think it's really important to meet communities where they are, to go in and ask questions about what are their needs, and find out what are their desires, where would they like to be in a few years, and meet them where they are. I think it's kind of like dealing with having a conversation with a friend, or a coworker. Try and do that, and then if that is their desire, then to make sure that plan really fits with the needs of that community. I think it's also important to think about thinking ahead of time in terms of what is it that we want to show, what successes do we want to see in our investments. So planning for that up front. I thought we had an awesome conversation around displacement. I learned a lot listening to that conversation. I think those kinds of issues really need to come front and center when we think about working in disadvantaged communities, planning for that ahead of time. And then I also think it's really important in all that we do, thinking about how to evaluate it. I'm going to probably say that every time I talk, but how to evaluate what we do, making sure that we not only do that up front, but also that we're collecting information and collecting data that matter. Not just collecting data for data's sake, but data that matter and data that can help improve the lives of the people we're trying to affect. So I think data that matter are incredibly important.
So from a transportation standpoint, two things. One, just to reinforce that concept of meeting folks where they're at, particularly just paying attention to the context of where the need is and where the city or the jurisdiction is at. I mean, we work a lot with a lot of our members are practitioners in like smaller communities, more rural areas. It may not make sense to implement these larger scale, expensive design solutions, grade separated bike paths or anything like that. A lot of times you can do simple things like, just making, slowing down traffic by making the road space more, just using simple things like pavement markings and things like that to slow down traffic, to make the overall space more walkable, more welcoming to multiple modes of travel. And so that's an easy implementable solution that we can share that can be used by agencies, communities small and large. So I think paying attention to that context being sensitive to that context is important. The other thing I think in particular with a lot of the Midwest, again, some of the more rural areas, is underscoring some of the economic development opportunities for transportation, and particularly looking beyond just automobiles. I don't remember the exact statistic right now, but it's something like 5-to-1 or 10-to-1 benefit cost ratio for building out bike sharing and bike paths and other like bicycle infrastructure, the resulting jobs and the attraction of new residents and people coming in and new businesses coming into these areas. Not only are you making the space more welcoming and safer for the people using the transportation system, but you're revitalizing a lot of those communities. And I think that's a message that resounds pretty strongly with practitioners, whether they're in transportation or public health or other policy areas.
So reinvestment fund was, thanks to the generous support of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we are actually working not in rural communities. I mean, there's communities which we're saying are mid-sized, small cities and towns on an initiative that's called Invest Health. And I think this initiative, what it's striving to do is to think about the capacities of these places, which is very different from the capacity of Philadelphia or Chicago. In terms of the resources, the skill sets, the talents, and just access to information about things. So the role we're primarily playing at this point is a convening role, a facilitating role, a sharing of information, data, that, to be quite frank, officials may not have access to under the normal, under other circumstances. So we also intentionally created a leadership team, which we said had to have a public sector official, either elected or appointed, a hospital or university, because usually you can find in a smaller town or city that type of anchor institution, and then someone who is thinking about a community-based type organization that's focused on development as well as others. And that in and of itself, I think I love that example that was given about having people ride, for miles in the car can facilitate collaboration and cross-thinking. Well, when you spend 2.5 days outside of your city in another place with others like you, there's a lot of excitement that generates and ideas.
Well, I think when I think if you were talking about interior space or office space and what you can do to improve that at low or no cost, I think there's an awful lot of things you can do, and always. I think that when a new trend comes, like health and wellness rating systems and things like that are now starting to creep into our practice and become, whereas things like the LEED rating system for sustainability, that really is best practice now, and in certain cities like Washington, it's a requirement. And so those things initially were expensive to do, but over time now they're commonplace and they're really mandated by code. And so I think as we progress, those things will work, health and wellness issues will work their way into codes as well. But there's just a lot of things that can be done to make a space more healthy and active. And a lot of that has to do with just policy with your organization. Like, one, you can say, we're not going to serve soda pop. I mean, I've done offices where people have a soda machine and they can go and get as much soda as they want, and with no limits. And that's probably not a good thing, and there's been a shift in thinking, and at the time we did it, we didn't think that much of it. But nowadays, you do think of those things, and just like, there's no such thing as a reformed environmentalist, I don't know that there's any such thing, if there's such a thing as a reformed person who cares about health and wellness. And so once you learn, you can't go back, you can't slip backwards. But there are many things like that that are available that are very low cost.
So another question, as we all know, in this country today, there's been millions of people affected by the twin hurricanes of Harvey and Irma and the impending hurricane of Jose. So I was trained as a lawyer. I like to think in hypotheticals all the time. I find it fun. So I have a hypothetical for my panelists. If there was a decision maker in Houston calling you right now and saying, we have a lot of immediate response that we need to do, but as we're beginning to think about rebuilding our communities, what advice do you have? So, so who would like to respond on advice for those in Florida and Houston and the surrounding areas?
I'll take Houston because I'm from Houston.
Okay.
I grew up in Houston. And in Houston, you can build anything anywhere. There's the zoning there. I'm not a planner, but you can build anything anywhere in the zoning. There's almost no zoning. So I think that's, there's a lot of concrete in Houston. There are some parks which are great, but the green space is pretty limited there, combined with the bios that intersect the city and the sprawl. And so I think, using New Orleans as a model with zoning, what's happened there, and really the improvement in zoning, use New Orleans as a model for Houston about what can be done around zoning. But yeah, and I also think that the attention to Houston recently, while it's devastating and it's really horrible what's happened, from being a Houstonian, I think it really places a great light on all of the things that Houston has to offer in terms of its art and everything that it has. So I think from a silver lining perspective, I think that's a good part.
I would emphasize how do you think about community decision-making input and voice in that planning process, even if it's about new zoning laws. And also being, I think, a lesson learned from Katrina is an insensitivity to cultural heritage. So in theory, you could think about, how to downsize or, the importance of more green space, but at the same time, for the people that were living there, it's not just a home. It was, part of a cultural heritage. And so you must, as we think about planning and land use, don't overlook those long traditions of culture and heritage and what that means to community. And I think the way you get at that is by really having community voice and decision making at that table.
That's a good point.
I think from a transportation perspective, the reality is that a lot of the most impactful tools or the impactful strategies are the ones that are the most expensive or that involve the significant physical design or reorganization of the public space. And so, as horrible as the hurricanes are, it does provide, a good opportunity to have some of those conversations about that larger scale rebuilding. I think one thing that's critical, at this stage and in terms of facilitating healthier communities through this rebuilding process is framing the message correctly. And so, I think there's that underlying importance that yes, rebuilding for healthy communities, safe communities is important. But I think from a transportation perspective, you can also underscore the building for resilience aspect. There's two components to resilience. There's risk and there's impact. And I think no one's going to argue that, or you can make a strong argument that having multiple transportation spaces that accommodate multiple modes of travel can really go a long way towards reducing impact, towards making evacuations easier, towards just generally making that people moving process that's tied around some of these large scale short-term movements of people. It can be done a lot more effectively when you have roads, you have sidewalks, you have bike paths, you have all of these different modes coming together in multiple spaces. And so I think framing that, having the right message for the right time, and understanding that all of these things are tied to the same outcome or the same desired physical space is important to get that buy-in.
Well, I would say that I would hope when those areas in Texas and Florida are rebuilt, that they wouldn't think it's one and done, this was a 1,000-year storm. No, it will happen again, it'll happen again soon, probably, that we're in a new reality where the 100-year floodplain is now the 20-year floodplain and so on, and that all of those maps are now being reconsidered and changed, and this is life going forward. We're going to have more storms, it's going to be warmer, we're going to have raise sea level. It's a fact, and so we're just going to have to deal with that. So I think I'd be curious to see what happened in Florida, because I know there have been codes that are down there that requirements for windows and high-rise buildings and things that are supposed to withstand up to 175-mile-an-hour winds and things. It would be interesting to see how well paying attention to those codes and how those buildings performed under that, because I think what's probably happened is the structures that were older were pretty much wiped out, and so when we rebuild, we just have to think a little bit more about how do we rebuild with the idea that this is going to happen again.
Absolutely. So I have just a couple comments, but we are going to have time for one or two questions. So if folks if they have questions, you can make your way to the mic. As I'm reflecting on that hypothetical as well, I actually am also thinking about your reaction comments to the day, thinking about really those stories and what resonates and how to have different messages for different messengers need to deliver different messages, whether you're talking to transportation engineers or whether you're talking to architects, different things will resonate with different types of decision makers. And then I also heard the complexity of these issues, right? So thinking about if folks in Houston are trying to solve for one or two problems, they actually need to be thinking about a whole bundle of problems and solution sets that can address all of those strategies and the complexities of that. And then I also heard sort of the inequities and the inherent inequities that exist in some of this built environment work, but also trying to keep being really targeted around how to make sure that there's optimal health design for all, not just for specific neighborhoods. So I'm just pulling the reflections from the day to if we could offer advice to Texas and Florida. So with that, I see Bill, do you have a question?
Thanks, and thanks for your comments. So one of the things I've been thinking about all day is we've really been focused on systems, and we've talked about changing those systems, but we haven't talked very much about policy resistance. And so I wonder if, and this was particularly apropos of this morning's comments, but it's equally, appropriate for this panel. What are the sources of policy resistance that get in the way of making the kinds of changes that we think are so important and relevant?
I think it's money. Having worked for a local government, having currently trying to advocate for resources to improve access to healthier foods, it comes down to a lot of time, particularly in this day and age, this feeling of, it's about your priorities, of course, but it is always this issue of cost and who pays for it.
Right, so that's a governance problem, isn't it? And isn't one of the deeper drivers that whatever those forces are that limit those funds? So how do we get to those, which I think is where change has to occur?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one way you get to it is we talked about this question of how do we sustain or create political will. And I think that can happen in multiple ways. We usually think of, the community or the voter, but I think there are particular influencers. So to the extent that you can bring the business community to the table as a co-partner saying, yes, this makes economic sense for our business interests. This creates jobs which can return revenues to a community. I think those are the way that you can begin to galvanize and support. I think getting to, you're talking about stories. Again, that human interest tends sometimes to go a little bit further of the story of the impact this investment is having on me as an individual. One of the most, I think, moving experiences I had was when we took a young man to Harrisburg at the beginning of the Pennsylvania Fresh Food Finance Initiative to talk about what that job meant to him, but not only to him, but to his younger brother, to be able to see him get up every day and go to a job and come home and not, dealing drugs and other. So that's another, and that people get that, and that I think that touches and particularly policymakers and elected officials. Those would be two things I would point to.
I think another source of policy resistance is just, I don't know if I call it policy resistance, but just not having a holistic view of policy. I mean, and the potential implications from changes in policy in one area to another. Again, I'll point to the transportation profession, and for I think the better part of a century, we've developed design policies and sort of best practices that focus on straight roads, wide lanes, clear zones on the sides of the road. I mean, that's all been baked into the policy with the intent of making the roadway a safe environment for drivers, not throwing up tons of distractions, with the thinking being that that's what suits the users of the road best. But I think where that falls short is not understanding the impacts that tends to have on speeding for drivers, and then the resultant safety and psychological impacts that has for other modes of travel. Those kinds of policy implications were just never really considered or given significant weight until recently. And so I think the local, from a transportation perspective, I think a lot of the policy resistance comes from, the politicians, the local decision makers who set a lot of that design policy and, the overall planning policy. And, from our end, just simply providing some of that education can go a long ways in just demonstrating how all those different moving pieces interact with one another, and what some of those trade-offs are as you make different tweaks to the policy areas.
I guess I'll just add that when in the surveys that we do at CDC, what we see is for many of the policies that we're interested in, complete streets, master plan, shared use agreements, we see a very consistent pattern geographically across the country. Fewer of those policies are adopted in the southeast region of the country. They tend to be more rural, and they tend to be smaller municipalities. So what is it about those places that they have in common that they're not at least adopting these types of policies? And I'm not sure that we know that yet. I think maybe it's more of a soft science type of a question to ask, but I do think we certainly see patterns. We see that I think it's about a quarter of municipalities right now have a complete streets policy. But what is it about those 75% of municipalities and that they're not adopting them? That doesn't have anything to do with implementation necessarily, but I'm not sure that we totally understand what's going on in terms of policy adoption.
One more question.
Do I get to have the last word here with the question? Great. Lovely. It's on the theme of policy resistance. I'm wondering, the first part of my life, I lived in Baltimore, where both housing, public and private, and schools were formally segregated. And there are lots of policies that were put in place, and policy cultures that were put in place at a time when it was overtly okay to arrange things so that certain people, ended up in certain places and so forth, that got better education. So is all that gone? Is anyone analyzing the discriminatory intent and effect of a lot of the policies that we're talking about? I think that must be a form of resistance, even if the people who are perpetuating the policies aren't aware of it, but maybe some scholarship that would point this out. Ed Ellinger talked about that for public health policies. I think that needs to be done as well, and I just wonder what you thought about that.
I think, yes, there's sort of like the remnants or the after effects of, legal segregation is the inequities that we see in our society today. And I think, a lot of people, when you talk to grassroots organization, it's about the power dynamic and how powerful is your voice in local government, in city councils, if people, who's voting, who's not voting. How do you organize folk to go to a zoning hearing to say, we want this here, and we need this, and this is, our right. In politics they say the squeaky wheel does get listened to. So some of it I think is just. Easy to overlook people who for rightfully have been overlooked and often are not in a position to make their voices heard for a lot of other reasons. So I think they almost go hand in hand. It's almost like a reinforcing thing that often happens. And I forgot which of the speakers talked about just the challenges of bringing people and getting people out to community meetings. And then what do you do to get them to come to the community meetings? And do we really think about, how do we facilitate participation in decision making? And often we don't.
Thank you.
We only have 8 minutes left, so what I'd love to do is invite my panelists to sort of share an action step. So this action step could be something that you want to take back as for yourself and your own organization, something that you want to suggest that this field at large take an action step or one way to move forward, or something even that organizations or groups part of this roundtable actually should be thinking about next. So you could take any one of those pathways of an action step, but never leave a meeting without an ask, right? Recovering lobbyist as well, so.
I'll go. 3 things. I think we need action steps. I think we need to, again, make sure that we're collecting the data, but the data that matter. Jim, in one of his very first slides, showed the Surgeon General's call to action to promote walking and walkable communities. We have a document out there that says we need to design communities so that they promote physical activity and walking, but we have no way in this country right now to measure walkability. We need to do better. We need to be able to measure those characteristics that make a community walkable. We need to do it at national, state, and local levels. And so I think that's something that we're very interested in, something we've been working on with folks in this room. So I think that's a to-do on our end in public health. I think partnerships are key. From a federal perspective, we need to work better across our other federal agencies. HUD, Department of Transportation, EPA, CDC, education. We should all be working together on these issues. I think that's one thing that we're trying to do better on. So I think the partnerships. I think from an evidence perspective, we need to really think beyond the health evidence, and everyone's talked about that today, but it's these additional benefits, co-benefits. How do these changes affect economic vitality, social cohesion? What are the other benefits that are being affected that sell to different audiences? And I think we also need to, finally, we need to think about how can we make these changes simple. People will be more likely to do them if they perceive them as simple. I think someone showed the lighter, quicker, cheaper, putting the hay bales out, protecting the, making kind of temporary bike lanes, inviting the mayors to come take a bike ride with you. How can we do more of those simple things that show people that these types of easy changes do have benefit?
I think for me, the takeaway in the action item really gets back to the question about rural places. And it's really important for my organization, Reinvestment Fund, because we're about to embark on an initiative where we're thinking, working in more rural communities around healthy food access. And even already what we've learning is that the issue of access is incredibly different, you know, in places like Montana, or even in places that like Appalachia, where geography can play a major role, and how it's not just about the built environment, but also other types of infrastructure like transportation, and how does a truck or you get food or fresh produce to places over long distances or over, you know, mountains and things of that nature. So I think that's my takeaway, is to really begin to think. It's a different, appreciate that context being so incredibly different from what we've been used to.
So I think for me, two takeaways, two action items. You know, we have a relatively nascent transportation and health task force. We also have what we call a Vision Zero task force, Vision Zero being more of a safety-focused program area. I think just the conversations today and some of the material today, I'll be taking that back to those task forces. With the Transportation and Health Task Force, you know, we just got started with that a couple of months ago. We're in the process of developing those short, medium, and long-term action items and goals. So I think all of this conversation today can help to inform that. I think from the Vision Zero Task Force perspective, like I said before, safety is an area that I think a lot of transportation professionals are a little bit more comfortable working in, rather than explicitly that transportation and health link. But I think the two go hand in hand. And so finding some more of those opportunities to connect between those program areas, I think is going to be one thing I'm going to work towards with those groups. The other thing, transportation professionals love to be able to take examples from other communities of things that have worked really well and say, hey, we can probably do this, you know, in our community. You know, there's evidence that it works. You know, that they can sell it to local decision makers. So, you know, I've been able, just in listening to presentations today and talking to a few folks, gotten some really good ideas for case studies, for examples from the health community that we can highlight those linkages to transportation for our membership to better understand how they can start to have those conversations with the health profession. So I think those are the two big action item areas for me following this.
Well, design for health and wellness is really a core value of our practice, and that we need to practice what we preach. And so we're a large firm and have offices in most of the major cities in North America. And so one of the things that we're doing right now is we are Fitwell champions. And we're having, I think 15 of our offices are seeking certification for this. This is something that you can go on the internet and just Google Fitwell and get it's a new rating system that is really a great roadmap to designing interior space that supports wellness and activity, and to also go to the website for the Center for Active Design, and you can get information there, just sort of a checklist that's really basic, but it'll start to educate you. And I really feel strongly that along with sustainability, health and wellness is something that can be taught at the workplace. You know, people get exposed to it there that might not otherwise get exposed to it. And if your organization has a policy that supports that, then people learn about it, and then they take it home, and then they tell their friends, and it starts to spread a little bit. So that's something that we're doing.
Great. And I'll just chime in by saying at RWJF, we've had a long history in investing in dedicating resources around built environment and creating those optimal health defaults in our communities. What we're thinking about now is, in addition to that, is also thinking about how do we promote opportunities in communities, opportunities defined very broadly. So not just looking at health and physical activity and healthy eating access, but also looking at what can we do as a foundation and actually leveraging assets and asset building increasing opportunities around economic pathways, and really trying to look at re-examining our historical roots around affordable housing. All of these are connected issues together, and how we actually try to catalyze and create those conditions for healthy communities. So there's lots of thinking, and we're also have been over the last year actually been working on a strategy on rural America and trying to understand what makes policy and communications efforts, why they need to look so different in rural communities across the country, and how solutions don't fit all communities, as we all know. That's just a bit from the foundation. But I think we are just 1 minute over, so my apologies for that. But I truly appreciate you all staying to the end of the day, and I'm going to actually pass it over to Jim Salas. Right? Is it nice passing it to you to close? That's what my notes say. You just do close.
All right, well, very quickly, I will just say thank you to everyone who stayed and participated, and even those joining us by webcast, if there's anybody left, and certainly there will be in the future. People will hear all the great buzz and the great examples and the wonderful actions taking place, and they will want to learn about that. And so thank you to this panel, really well done. And I guess I will leave you with an invitation and, an invitation to answer Monica's question for yourself and for your organization. And what is your next step? How will you put into practice what you learned today? Whether that's a new collaboration with one of the organizations that you learned about today, or you can learn about others. There are many groups that are relevant for partnerships and collaboration. And there's definitely things that all of us can do, and hopefully you've been impressed with the need to do these things to create more healthy and equitable environments to improve health and well-being of our population. So with that, I think I will close it out and go and have a healthy rest of your day.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.